Guten Tag und Hallo. Ich bin Billy Badger und Sie haben's erraten. Sogar der Hund weiß es. Ist es langsam Zeit für Kapitel 7. Herzlich willkommen. Wir hören gern Musik. Auf YouTube, auf Apple Musik, auf Spotify. Nicht mehr so oft auf CD, aber wir haben viele neue, aber auch alte CDs. Wir haben im Moment keinen guten CD-Spieler, aber wir haben einen guten Plattenspieler und auch viele Schallplatten, neue und alte. Wir mögen den neuen Plattenspieler, aber unser Lieblingsplattenspieler ist ein alter. Er ist fast 100 Jahre alt. Und wir haben viele alte Schallplatten. Die alten Platten sind klein, ziemlich schwer und brechen auch sehr leicht. Es ist kein elektronisches Gerät. Es gibt eine Kurbel und man zieht ihn auf. We use adjectives a lot, and even fairly early on, we learn some useful adjectives to describe ourselves, our eye colour and our hair colour. But this week, we want to start looking more closely at how we use adjectives, so we can provide detailed descriptions of people, places and things. And before we get started, it's worth pointing out that some of what we'll be doing this week assumes knowledge of cases, the nominative and the accusative. So this means the work that we did last week on subjects and objects. And so if you haven't watched the video from last week, this would be a good time to go and do that. And to be fair, I think probably most of us already know what adjectives are. They describe nouns. And in German, like in English, we're going to think about using them in two different ways. And so here I need to introduce two fancy grammatical terms because where the adjective is used in a sentence will, to some extent, determine the form of the adjective itself. So let's first look at the two different ways of using adjectives. Firstly, you can use adjectives simply as a description of what something or someone is. The chair is small or the man is kind. Used in this way, we call the adjectives predicate adjectives, and they're easy to use in German. Das Buch ist gut, das Auto ist kaputt, die Musik ist lustig, der Bär ist gelb oder der Kaffee ist heiß. To use adjectives in this way, we can simply look up an adjective in the dictionary and use it as a description without any further modification. So just in case you're thinking to yourself, this is easy, I can go and watch some cat videos now, let's look at the second way to use adjectives because it gets just a little bit trickier. Okay, so we could rephrase our original sentences and say, not the chair is small, but that is a small chair. Or not, for example, the man is kind, but that is a kind man. Used in this way, we call the adjectives attributive adjectives. Of course, in English, there is no difference. Either way, we just use the adjective as we find it in the dictionary. But this is German, and we need to think about gender and cases. So a word of warning now. Any adjective used in this way, any attributive adjective, needs an ending whether you like it or not. It's not just any random ending. So with that warning echoing in your brains, let's think quickly about one of the jobs of articles and adjectives. Now, we already know that articles give us information about gender, particularly, of course, the definite articles. And to keep things easy here, we'll just think for the moment about subject articles. So the definite article does a great job of showing us what the gender of a noun is. Some examples you might already know. Das ist der Bär. Das ist die Tasse. Das ist das Buch. Well, so far, so good. The der in the first example tells us that der is masculine. The D in the second example, of course, tells us that Tasse is feminine. And the das tells us that Buch is neuter. Well, let's see what happens when we use an adjective. Let's try adjectives for size that we're already familiar with. Groß and klein, big and small. Now, we can't just say, das ist der Großbär, das ist die Großtasse, nor can we say, das ist das Großbuch, oder der Kleinbär, oder die Kleintasse, oder das Kleinbuch. Because we already know that the adjective has to have an ending. Well, the definite article already tells us the gender, so the adjective doesn't have to. We put on the simplest ending that we can think of, an E, and we end up with sentences like das ist der große Bär und der kleine Bär. Similarly, we have das ist die große Tasse und die kleine Tasse. Und das ist das große Buch und das kleine Buch. Well, the indefinite article, on the other hand, it's not really responsible for giving us much information about the gender of the nouns. And we know this already. Let's take the same examples again, firstly with no adjectives, just to review the articles. Das ist ein Bär, das ist eine Tasse, das ist ein Buch. We remember that the only thing these indefinite articles tell us, in the subject case at least, is whether something is feminine or not. And unless we knew it, we wouldn't be able to tell whether Bär, or Buch for that matter, was masculine or neuter. Either way is just ein. The only thing we know is it's not feminine. So here is where the adjective comes in. Since the indefinite article doesn't give us much information about gender, the adjective does. You'll see that it makes sense to say, das ist ein großer Bär und das ist ein kleiner Bär. Das ist eine große Tasse und das ist eine kleine Tasse. Das ist ein großes Buch und das ist ein kleines Buch. So when we use articles and adjectives, pretty much always one or the other has to show us the gender of the noun, and at the beginning at least, not both of them. Okay, so look, it's time to test ourselves. I'm going to give you some examples of things you probably don't know the word for, or for that matter, the gender. And I want you to work out what the gender is and looking at the articles or the adjectives. So here we go. Das ist ein großes Objektiv. Das ist ein alter Fotoapparat. Das ist eine alte Münze. Das ist ein bunter Stoffaffe. Das ist ein kaputtes Auto. Das ist ein komischer Hocker. Das ist eine kleine Geige. Das ist ein kleines Schwein. Das ist eine schwarze Teekanne. Das ist ein kleiner Stuhl. Das ist ein kleines Fernbedienungsgerät. Das ist eine kleine Kamera. Das ist eine alte Holzschachtel. Das ist ein teurer Füller. Das ist ein altes Stofflamm. So here the adjectives tell us pretty clearly, I think, what the gender is. And if you've been paying attention over the last couple of weeks, you'll know that one of the articles changes in the object case. So while we've just been talking about the subject case, we're going to turn now to the object case. This was, of course, the masculine. Again, everything is going to be exactly the same, except for when we talk about masculine objects. I'll show you some of the things I have, and you'll see that it's actually pretty easy and pretty obvious what we have to do. Here, of course, the thing I have will be the direct object. And for masculine things, we need to use that en ending that we're familiar with from our work with articles. Ich habe einen kaputten Toyota. Ich habe einen komischen Hocker. Ich habe einen kleinen Stuhl. Ich habe einen neuen Fotoapparat. Ich habe einen großen Bildschirm. There's just one more example that we need that's going to take care of most of the other possibilities for using adjectives. Well, you've probably already asked yourself, what do we do about plurals? Well, you remember that often plural articles look very similar to feminine articles. Das ist die Tasse und das sind die Tassen. It's die in both cases. Of course, the verb tells us that we're dealing with a plural, but the adjectives, if we're using one, help out too. They help us to distinguish between feminine and plural. Let's take a look at that example again, using klein as our adjective. Das ist die kleine Tasse and das sind die kleinen Tassen. Now it's going to take us a while to get used to using all of this, but I want to finish up with a couple of general rules. Attributive adjectives. Adjectives used in front of a noun need endings. And with a couple of exceptions we've talked about, it's mostly true that adjectives following the definite article get an E ending. Most adjective endings are the same for the subject and object cases. And for this to make sense, we need practice. So head over now to your textbook, try some exercises from Chapter 6. Also das war's dann für heute und auch für diese Woche. Ich wünsche Ihnen eine schöne Woche und wie immer, wenn Sie Fragen haben, schreiben Sie sie unten in den Kommentaren. Alles Gute, auf Wiedersehen und Tschüss.